Well, thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to see you all. Thank you very much for giving up your Friday afternoon. This being the last lecture that I give, I'm delighted to say that after 31 years, I have fulfilled my ambition of never giving a lecture with PowerPoint. There will be no slides. And before I start, I would like to thank Almut, Chair of the Faculty Board, for this very kind invitation to give this valedictory lecture. And of course, the faculty team, a big thank you for organising everything, especially Sarah and Digna. So I've taken this as an opportunity to introduce a book that I've edited, which appeared in June last year. And of course, because of the circumstances, we haven't had a chance to have a book launch. Many people contributed to it. And as most of you will know, I am not a theatre specialist. We don't have a drama department at Oxford. And yet many Oxford colleagues and students, both undergraduate and postgraduate, helped to shape it. The book is called New Drama in Russian: Performance, Politics and Protest in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. So this is the book. Some of you may have seen it. I'm just going to show the cover here to the camera. The cover is something I'm extremely pleased with. It's a poster for a show which was produced at the Diki Theatre, the Wild Theatre in Kiev in 2017. It was a poster for a play by somebody called Vitaly Chensky, and the title was A Show About a Man. And what I like about the cover is that, of course, it ingeniously takes the image of the Vitruvian man and depicts a modern man in search of his personal and sexual identity in contemporary Ukraine. But before I talk about the book itself, I perhaps wanted to share with you my thoughts about where this project came from, given that I'm not a theatre specialist. And of course, the origins in the end go back a very long way, and quite a few chance events prompted it. I did my postgraduate work in the very late 70s and the early 80s on Mikhail Bulgakov, who is known in the West largely as a novelist, but in his own lifetime, he was known as the most exciting playwright of the day. So I did have to find out about theatres and plays as part of that work. And while I was doing archival research for my DPhil in Moscow, I spent a lot of time hanging out there with Michael Boyd, later Sir Michael Boyd, who became the artistic director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And in fact, the only training Michael Boyd ever had as a theatre director was 6 months that he spent in Moscow at the same time as me. And Michael took me to all sorts of amazing shows that I wouldn't have got to otherwise. It's astonishing stagings of the classics. And he also introduced me to some quirky experimental drama. A lot of time passes. I eventually get my job in Oxford 30 years ago. And a few years after that, my colleagues in the Russian department, subfaculty, happened to make changes to the first year prescription of texts. And they neatly removed every single play. At which point I thought, well, that's a real shame, because of course the drama tradition in Russian is so fantastic. So at that point I devised an honours course, a special subject option in Russian drama instead. And that's been running now for probably 15 years or more. And that introduces students to a whole range of texts. They're meant to read 16 or 18 texts, starting in the 1820s and coming up to the Glasnost era, to the 1980s. And in 2008, one of Jennifer Baines's students, undergraduates, Will Measham, came back from his year abroad. He was a real theatre maker and had spent time going to a festival of contemporary drama. And he said, look, could we perhaps, instead of studying some of the texts that you've got on the syllabus, how about doing some contemporary drama? And so he steered my first choice of texts. And very shortly afterwards, in 2009 and 2010, Michael Boyd organised a wonderful season of Russian contemporary drama, slightly improbably, at Stratford, the RSC at Stratford. And I became very involved in that with several of my students, including Will Measham, and they helped out. They herded Russian break dancers around Stratford. I gave talks, helped to plan things, looked over translations, and I gave every help I could to the design, the costume, the props, the music, the movement departments. I think my most recherche achievement was to establish for the movement department how space cadets in the 1960s moved their feet in order to adopt the at ease position. And partly because of that, and partly because I was talking to other theatres, for a few years I found myself helping quite a lot of theatres to stage Russian plays, not necessarily contemporary ones. The person who then moved it forward was Oliver Reddy. He probably doesn't realise this, but he organised a wonderful symposium at St Anthony's on contemporary Russian prose and Russian poetry. And sitting around in the pub afterwards were Philip Bullock, my colleague and dear friend, Sasha Dugdale, who is the sort of presiding angel of Russian contemporary drama translation and indeed poetry and prose as well, and also Noah Berkstead-Breen. I hasten to say that Noah, like Oliver, is a former undergraduate at one of my colleges, and I have been their tutor, and I can safely say that I did nothing whatsoever to shape what they then did. But we, between us, agreed that this was a real gap. We ought to have some event looking at contemporary drama instead. And so we started to plan together the first of what would become a series of 3 contemporary drama workshops, which we held at Wolfson College. The first one in November 2014 was called Back to the USSR Query. The second one in April 2017 was called Playwriting Without Borders. And there was a smaller one as part of a larger workshop in June 2019 called Staging Queer Lives in Russia and Ukraine. And these all focused on the staging of Russian language drama in Russia, Ukraine and Belarus since the beginning of the 21st century. That very conveniently coincides exactly with Vladimir Putin's period in power because he became acting president on the 31st of December 1999. One aspect of the initial project was essentially to try and get more modern Russian language plays staged in Britain. So each of these 3 workshops involved theatre scholars, but also playwrights, theatre directors and critics, and we combined academic papers with roundtable discussions, but we also had rehearsed readings and translation sessions. And indeed, a number of British productions of Russian plays did emerge from those workshops, largely initiated and curated by Noah Berkstead-Breen, who had established himself in London already as the director of a theatre which he had founded himself, Sputnik Theatre, which existed solely to present Russian language drama to British audiences. But this fitted in, therefore, very well with his own projects. Our workshops sort of generated discussion and identifying of plays and so on. But this project of wanting to stage Russian drama on the British stage also created a good fit with Oxford's AHRC-funded project Creative Multilingualism, led since 2016 by Katrin Cole. Philip and I formed a very fun strand together with Professor Rajinder Dudra of Birmingham City University, and we soon were joined by Noah Berkstead-Breen, and as a quartet we did all sorts of fun things. The most exciting outcome of that work for Creative Multilingualism on the Russian drama side was a reworking of Ivan Voropayev's intensely beautiful and violent 2002 play Oxygen. Under the guidance of Rajinder Dudra and Noah Berkstead-Breen, it received an extraordinary reinterpretation by hip-hop artists from Birmingham and Leicester, Lady Sanity and Stanza Divan. That actually counted for impact, I have to say, although I did have interesting discussions with the Central University Administration on impact when they said that my title, Russian Drama on British Stages, was no good, and that I had to say it wasn't any good because it didn't have a verb. So it had to be called Enabling the Staging of Russian Drama on British Stages. Anyway, Philip and I then joined a second parallel AHRC project under the same hourly scheme, which was led from Manchester and Durham between 2016 and 2020 by Steve Hutchings and Andy Byford. And it was in fact this second project, shaped by an investigation into transnationalism, which prompted the 2017 workshop called Playwriting Without Borders, which in turn led to the creation of this book. Participants in the 2017 workshop came from Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, as well as Britain, the USA, Canada, Poland, France and Italy. And the principal research question we were addressing in considering the Russian language drama scene in the light of transnationalism was the fact that in the course of the last 20 years, there has been a massive transformation in that world. Whereas the first decade of the century, from 2000 to 2010, had seen a very lively shared theatre-making endeavour under the broad title of New Drama, hence New Drama in Russian. This has been pursued very creatively and really unproblematically by Russian language writers and theatre makers from the now independent post-Soviet states of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. But more recently, that situation has changed. So the key to this success in the first decade of the 21st century was the participants' shared use of the Russian language. So previously, writers from all three nations happily collaborated on projects, took part in festivals, judged competitions, held workshops and so on in all three countries. However, the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, especially after the occupation of Crimea in the spring of 2014, have deeply problematized these relationships. At the same time, but in very different ways, the question of using the Belarusian language rather than Russian has become a much more complex issue for Belarusian playwrights. So our book therefore traces the falling apart of what had been a transnational cultural phenomenon which thrived across borders as it became a highly politicized issue shaped by political hostilities and nationalist pride. So our contributions in this volume focus especially on the decade from 2009 to 2019, which means that we've essentially tried to capture the contours of a transitional moment as the cultural scene in this region realigns itself in new patterns. So I want to turn to the book itself now, which is in three major sections, not surprisingly, starting with Russia and then moving on to Ukraine and Belarus. And I'll start with Russia. And I'll be describing some of the contributions as I go along. One of the great joys of doing this project was that for completely different reasons, research reasons, I found myself in Paris quite a lot in these years and got to know some of the French scholars who are theatre specialists and was very struck by the fact that we knew very little about the French scholarship and they knew very little about the English language scholarship. It's incredibly easy to be complacent and assume that everybody reads either the Russian scholarship or the English scholarship. And it was incredibly nice to get to know the French scholars. And they provided the first two major contributions, which were survey pieces on the background since the collapse of the Soviet Union up to the present day. And they're terrific pieces by Marie-Christine Auton-Mathieu and by Lucie Kempf. And they describe the way in which, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian culture and drama in particular has been utterly transformed. With the removal of state subsidies, with the lifting of restrictions on repertory, well-established theatres in the major Russian cities now rush to fill their seats by staging more commercially appealing productions, so glitzy musicals, imported sell-out shows. So the liberation actually made life very difficult for contemporary playwrights who found it incredibly difficult to find a venue where they could stage their work. At the same time, if one theme which playwrights of the last decade or so of the 20th century were particularly wary of was politics. It was so heavily overburdened in the era of socialist realism, the Soviet era, with responsibility to be either for or against the existing regime, that politics falls away in the last decade. During the 1990s, one striking feature of the theatre scene became the emergence of many, many more women playwrights. They almost dominate the scene in the latter decade of the 20th century. And many of these women writers turned their attention entirely away from the public sphere to depict what was actually happening on the domestic scene instead, which had not been represented under socialist realism. This formed part of a trend across literary genres, which came to be known by the disparaging term чернуха, which suggested the uncovering of the murky and sordid realities of family life in overcrowded apartments, shaped by drink and drugs, sexual exploitation, poverty, domestic violence, a kind of washing of dirty linen in public, which some audiences welcomed for its truthfulness, while others decried its shaming revelations. But the collapse of Soviet ideological controls had also prompted the setting up of new independent theatres, playwriting competitions and drama festivals. The annual Lyubimovka competition for new drama dates back to 1990. The Golden Mask, Zolotaya Maska festival started in 1994. A new centre for playwrights and directors opens in Moscow in 1998, and so on. One key aspect of these developments was that they were neither confined to the Russian Federation, nor indeed to the capital cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Some of the most important figures in the new Russian language playwriting of new drama were, for example, Maxim Kurachkin, Natalia Vorozhbit from Ukraine, and Pavel Preshko from Belarus, and many others. As for the Russian regions, in Yekaterinburg and the Urals, Nikolai Kalyada had set up an influential school for playwriting and also created an important Eurasia playwriting competition. Somebody else established a festival in Tolyatti. Exciting theatre was also being made in Krasnoyarsk na Amurye, Perm, Chelyabinsk, Kemerovo, and so on. Many other provincial cities. So it's a very interesting phenomenon which is spread across a very large geographical region and not just Russia. And all of these developments would variously become associated with the umbrella term new drama. It's a slightly nebulous, occasionally disputed term, but it serves well to define, in the last 20 years, a combination of documentary approaches, pared back staging, uninhibitedness of language, and willingness to address painful topics, whether personal, sexual abuse, homophobia, drug addiction, or political, the situation with Ukraine, political scandals, abuses in the justice system. And this really characterizes the most exciting independent Russian theatre up until certainly 2018, perhaps even beyond. A new drama is certainly the playwriting that has attracted international attention, translation, and occasional stagings abroad during this period. The first seminal study of 2009 was written by Birgit Boimers, herself an Oxford DPhil, and Marek Lipowiecki. And they highlight violence as being fundamental to this new experimental trend. Firstly, it demonstrates the disintegration of the Soviet social order. It also reflects new post-Soviet social practices connected with the redistribution of authority and economic capital. And it also functions as a denotation of the sacred, or more specifically, the ritual of transgression of the sacred. During these years, there was also a new openness and an opportunity to pool experience with theatre companies from other countries. And one very well-known international collaboration involved several visits by members of London's Royal Court Theatre to Russia towards the end of the 1990s. These were facilitated by the British Council and in particular by Sacha Dugdale, who was a key figure in this whole process. They held various workshops, and one of them is said to have sparked the imagination of a married couple, Yelena Gremina and Mikhail Ugarov, who in 2002, with a number of colleagues, founded theatre.doc, perhaps the most influential and innovative Moscow theatre company for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And as their ironically punning name suggests, the theatre's focus was on the use of documentary and sometimes verbatim material to create drama texts. And it is they, Gremina and Ugarov, and others, who in 2002 launched the annual New Drama Festival. And I'm just going to dwell on theatre.doc for a moment. And this is all drawing on the work about Russia, which Autant Mathieu and Kempf and others contributed to the volume. So in supporting the development of play texts originating in documentary or verbatim material, Theatre.doc shifted primacy away from the well-made play shaped by plot. This aligned their projects with broader notions of the post-dramatic as articulated by Hans-Thies Lehmann, with its reconfiguration of the function of the performer, who becomes not so much an actor interpreting a role as an agent for activating the engagement of the audience. This focus led to a reconfiguration of the entire theatrical experience as well, with performances in small-scale, poor theatre black box spaces with stripped back, minimal sets, props, costumes and makeup. The audience members' experience ceases to be constructed around the suspension of disbelief. Instead, performances gain an in-your-face immediacy, and the active engagement of the audience is intensified by discussion sessions after each performance about issues raised in the shows. Theatre.doc's documentary approach has also allowed hitherto underrepresented or marginalized voices to come to the fore, such as those of the disaffected young, gay people, migrants, feminists, or prisoners. These voices also brought a new language to the stage, often including a lexicon specific to their social milieu, youth culture, drug culture, as well as a mass of obscenities and swear words. And this latter point, the use of obscenity, represented a great breach of one of the main taboos of Soviet culture for much of the 20th century, during which time language, published language in the public sphere had been largely sanitized. In the early years of Theatre.doc, Gremina and Ugarov claimed that they were attempting to adopt what they called a zero position. So, for example, in 2004, they created a play called September.doc, which was prompted by the horrific events that year in Beslan, which you'll all remember, when Chechen separatists occupied a school and took over 1,000 people hostage, many of them children, and there was then a siege in which they endured appalling conditions, and a third of the hostages eventually lost their lives. Gremina and Ugarov trawled the internet for online discussions and assembled a documentary text made up of comments juxtaposing aggressive justifications of the violence with peace-loving sentiments uttered by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. They therefore left the audience to confront their own prejudices and form their own judgments about the events. By 2010, however, this neutral stance adopted by Theatre.doc had shifted somewhat. Gremina crafted the play 1 hour and 18 minutes in outraged response to the tragic fate of the tax lawyer Sergei Magnitsky, who had died an agonizing death in Remand prison after brutal mistreatment and apparently deliberate neglect of his severe medical problems. You'll remember he was somebody who worked for an Anglo-American businessman and was in the end accused of all the crimes which he was himself employed to investigate. Gremina acknowledged that this piece represented a shift in her approach. It became an indictment of the police and justice system in contemporary Russia, a view shared by Western governments, which in 2012 introduced the Magnitsky Act to impose sanctions on officials held to be complicit with the scandal, sanctions which are still in force to this day. The reasons for the shift in attitudes within Theatre.doc at the end of the first decade of the 21st century were largely shaped by the shifts in the political sphere, driven by Vladimir Putin's determination to impose increasingly authoritarian rule and to tighten the grip of the state in cultural matters, particularly after the 2011-2012 election campaign, which prompted many protests on the streets. Contemporary drama thus proved very responsive to issues of electoral legitimacy, police brutality, and the increasingly blatant corruption and injustices in public life in Russia. And of course, drama generally is better suited to escape control than almost any other genre for two reasons. One of them is because the difference between what's on the page, which is viewed by the censor, and what happens on the stage can be absolutely fundamental. And also because a performance on one day can differ very much on a different day. So it's much harder to monitor and to regulate. So in recent Theatre.doc productions, human rights activism has become the predominant characteristic, and they have focused on the rights of women, of gay people, of prisoners, of those oppressed by the church or subjected to police brutality or denied their legal and political rights. And they're not the only people. One recent show at another important Moscow theatre called the Meyerhold Center was simply made up, this is in 2018, it was called The Constitution, and it was simply made up of a reading, an embodied performance of all the articles of the Russian Constitution to remind people of their legal rights. A really exciting contribution to this book was made by our recent DPhil student, now Dr. Alex Thomas, as of about 3 weeks ago, in a piece of work that I asked him to contribute, which arose out of the first chapter that he was working on for me. He was going to work on various issues to do with language and violence in contemporary drama, and we hadn't really worked out what he was going to focus on. But I did say, well, why don't you just go away and start off by kind of keeping track of all the recent legislation, the recent measures that have been introduced to control what's gone on. And when he came back with his work, I think I helped him to realize how startling the picture was that he had uncovered, and to help him to shape it, perhaps. This stream of new measures part of a raft of legislation and state guidelines which relate to the sphere of culture, and they're introduced with the aim of bringing artists and artworks more tightly under government control. They're especially visible from the spring of 2012 in the aftermath of the electoral protests. And Alex Thomas has traced the measures which during the 2010s, since that moment, have weaponized culture as an instrument of Russian state propaganda in an attempt to fashion a clean living, pious and patriotic nation. So, new laws have, in 2013, forbidden any form of promotion to minors of what are euphemistically termed non-traditional sexual relations. Draconian penalties were also introduced that year for those who were found to offend against religious sensibilities. All obscenities are completely banned from the page, the screen and the stage, what is essentially the first censorship law since the Soviet era. There have been attempts to limit access to the internet. The most recent modification of the Constitution in 2020 bans the misrepresentation of Soviet actions during the Second World War, and indeed other historical events where they're to be interpreted in the public sphere unless they can correspond to official versions of the past. And in 2019, a law was introduced to ban obvious disrespect for society, or the state, or official state symbols, or the Constitution, or the organs of state power. So these legislative measures have been introduced against the backdrop of resurgent Russian nationalism, and it all fits very well with President Putin's program. He is, of course, notorious for his long-held view, articulated more than once, that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the last century was the collapse of the USSR. It's becoming increasingly apparent that as someone who was shaped by his communist-era upbringing and his training as a KGB officer, Putin is most comfortable with a vision of culture as a monolithic, state-controlled phenomenon whose role is to promote government values and form a new kind of citizen while suppressing dissident voices. And this is where he's accomplished the most extraordinary sleight of hand. He's removed Communist Party ideology, and he has inserted Russian Orthodoxy, or the values, social values of the Russian Orthodox Church, and nationalism, and is coming to much the same result. In other words, the practices of the cultural world which have been emerging in the last few years in Russia are very, very reminiscent of the practices of socialist realism, which shaped much of the Soviet era. It's a recreation, a reconfiguration of a system. It's not called socialist realism, but it operates and is expected to achieve the same goals in many ways. One of the key figures in articulating the government's new vision for culture was Vladimir Medinsky, who was Minister of Culture from 2012 until 2020. In June 2015, he published a notorious article in Izvestia, which carried the title, "Anyone who fails to nurture his own culture is nurturing a foreign army." As well as insisting that the state should retain control over subsidized content, the article thus instrumentalized culture as an element of national security against supposed external enemies. How did this all start off? with an event you're very familiar with, the Pussy Riot punk prayer scandal in February 2012, when a group of 5 women pranced about and sang a protest song in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, in which they criticised the Orthodox Church for its support of the Putin regime. The whole event barely lasted a couple of minutes, but they were charged with hooliganism driven by religious hatred, and 2 of their number were sentenced to 2 years in prison. And the tradition of actionism, such as unsanctioned protest events, has continued to be viewed as intensely provocative and is fiercely clamped down on by the authorities. A more recent scandal to shake the theatre world began to develop in 2017 around the figure of the outstanding film and theatre director Kirill Serebrennikov. You may have followed this story. He was accused of embezzling funds, arrested, kept under house arrest for over a year. The Bolshoi Theatre cancelled the premiere of a biographical ballet he had scripted about Rudolf Nureyev, which was uninhibitedly explicit about his homosexuality. He was eventually released from house arrest in 2019, but then in the verdict widely condemned by human rights organisations, he was found guilty in June 2020, fined and given a suspended sentence. Commenting on this campaign against Serebrennikov, Irina Prokhorova has noted this is the first time since the arrest, torture and murder of Vsevolod Meyakhovs during the Stalin terror that a cultural figure of this stature has been persecuted by the Russian authorities. Theatre.doc was subjected to repeated harassment from 2014-15 onwards. There were regular visits from the police, from the city licensing authorities, as well as provocations from right-wing nationalist groups and occasional scathing attacks in the media. All of these stresses, which forced them to move their premises 3 times in 3 years, may have contributed to the health troubles which led to the early deaths of both Mikhail Ugarov and Irina Gremina within 6 weeks of each other early in 2018, each of them at the age of 62. These are people who came to our seminars and were wonderful people to meet, and it was a tragic loss for the theatre world. It looks as though the loss of Ugarov and Gremina essentially marks the end of new drama as a coherent movement and leaves many challenges behind for those who are trying to pick up the next stage. Mark Lipovietsky, writing after their deaths, concluded that they had educated an entire generation of actors, directors and playwrights, and people will speak about their era as a golden age of Russian documentary and political theatre. Life in Russia at the moment is extremely challenging, continues to be very challenging. One playwright who I know well observed to me in 2017, "It's a really painful matter for artists today. I, as a dramatist, cannot do anything other than write a play which cannot be staged in Russia." Do you understand what that feels like? And if we wanted a glimpse of just how absurd the authorities' paranoia is, a theatre director called, who's a director of an experimental theatre called The Theatre to Go, was arrested in May 2019 on Red Square. His crime was that he stood on his own holding a poster which said, "Against the Stanislavski method." Okay, so I want to move on now to Ukraine and Belarus. Apart from a couple of articles in the book in which individual Ukrainian plays are analysed by the American scholars Molly Thomas-Blazing and Jessica Hines-Bond, the cultural politics of this period in Ukrainian drama have been vividly conjured up for us by Noah Berkstead-Breen and also Jack Clover, together with Molly Flynn, who's a lecturer at Birkbeck. Noah Berkstead-Breen, who during this same time completed his doctoral thesis on contemporary drama at Queen Mary. So Noah undertook 2 very fruitful trips to Ukraine as my research assistant in 2017. Following upon his interviews with theatre makers and his observations of the current drama scene, he identifies the year 2014 as marking the decisive break between the worlds of modern Russian and Ukrainian theatre, with the popular uprising of 2013 and 14 known as the Maidan, swiftly followed by Russia's incursion into Crimea. He also explores how aesthetic considerations as well as institutional structures have shaped the development of Ukrainian theatre ever since the collapse of the USSR in 1991. So his article again is an introductory survey starting from the 1990s up to the present day. In more recent times, the emergence of a fringe theatre in Ukraine has not been welcomed by the nation's mainstream establishments, which remain very conservative, but it does represent a fresh start. And so what's under discussion is the formation of an independent Ukrainian new drama as a different phenomenon in the aftermath of the collapse of the shared endeavour. And Ukrainian new drama would henceforth address its own national issues, and it represents a reforging of these playwrights' identities after that traumatic break. Some leading playwrights, including Valedictory and Kurechkin, have forced themselves to learn Ukrainian if they weren't entirely fluent in it previously, and are now attempting to write only in that language. Kurechkin describes this as having been a bitter and traumatic experience. He feels that circumstances have constrained him to deny and reject all his previous Russian language work, created, as it were, in the language of the oppressors. And when he came to speak to us, he was very emotional about the sense that he had lived a life which he now rejected and despised. He felt obliged to turn his back on his work of the past. So Noah's piece is followed by two contributions by Jack Clover. Jack Clover is one of Polly's former students, and together with another of her students, Daisy Hayes, neither of whom I taught, I have to say. They did come to some of my discussions, but anyway, they spent a great deal of time living and working with Ukrainian theatres between 2017 and 2019. Jack is himself a very gifted playwright, and he learnt the language, had his plays staged in Ukraine, and became very involved in the theatre world there, even sitting on judging panels at theatre festivals. Perhaps based on this personal experience, he writes one rather scathing piece about the high-handed attitudes that Ukrainian theatre directors adopt in relation to playwrights and their texts. He thinks that playwrights are undervalued in the Ukrainian scene. He also has a debate with Noah about whether you should date Ukrainian new drama from 2018 rather than from 2014. But he contributed an interview with Maxim Kurechkin, with whom he collaborated, and they both agree that in Ukraine too, one of the really striking features of the best of new Ukrainian drama is the emergence of very powerful female voices, Valedictory, Natalia Bloch and Anastasia Kasady. But they also agree, Jack and Maxim, that it is a huge advantage for new Ukrainian drama in the present moment that theatre makers in Ukraine are not subjected to the tight controls and censorship imposed on their friends and former colleagues in Russia over the last 8 or 9 years. And the section on Ukraine is rounded off by Molly Flynn, who is herself a theatre maker as well as an academic. She's the author of a recent monograph on witness theatre in 21st century Russia. And she describes a Ukrainian group who she collaborated with, called the Theatre of Displaced People, founded in 2015. This tries to give a voice to those who are caught up, Ukrainian citizens caught up in the ongoing internal hostilities in Ukraine between government forces and Russian-backed separatists in the east of the country. And through the process of sharing personal testimonies, they aim to instigate dialogue between Ukrainians who found themselves in opposing camps. Molly Flynn, together with Valedictory and the Theatre of Displaced People, have also developed a social theatre project called Class Act, which started off originally at the Travis Theatre in Edinburgh in the 1990s, and which has been very widely adopted across Russia and Ukraine by theatre makers belonging to the new drama movement. And then finally, I want to move on to Belarus. This section of the book is made up firstly of a set of contributions by the Belarusian cultural commentator Tanya Artsimovich, who considers the evolution of new drama in Belarus since the early 2000s. Given the repressive regime of President Lukashenko, who has been in office since 1994 and has been described as by the Bush administration, most specifically as the last dictator in Europe, experimental or outspoken playwrights have found very few outlets for their work in their native country in the last 2 or 3 decades. Instead, Belarusian playwrights have flourished on the Russian scene, on the Russian new drama scene. I did one quick survey of the playwrights who have been performed at the Lyubimovka annual festival in Moscow, which I've attended several times. And Pavel Preshko, who's a Belarusian playwright, is the most frequently performed playwright on their entire list. And there are many other Belarusian, good Belarusian playwrights, but they function in Russian and they function in Russia. Artsimovich contributes an interview with Preshko as well as an overview of his work. She observes, however, that events in neighbouring Ukraine since 2014 have prompted Belarusians to a re-examination of their own hitherto unhesitating use of the Russian language. Since 2014, a number of playwrights have experimented more with writing in Belarusian or in the hybrid language, which is a Belarusian-Russian dialect known as Trasyanka. This is all a somewhat strange phenomenon, this turn towards Belarusian, because hitherto it was only spoken by a relatively small minority of the population and largely in rural populations. So the adoption of it for playwriting and this attempt to elevate its use for broad literary purposes is regarded as very artificial by some people. And the whole question is very much complicated by the tricky relations, political and economic relations between Belarus and Russia, with Putin apparently part of the time viewing Lukashenko as a rather tiresome partner, while at the same time he's pressurizing Belarus very strongly to enter into much closer economic ties with Russia, possibly in the hope of replicating the kind of political relationship which existed during the Soviet era. So the adoption of Belarusian as a literary language and its use in drama might be seen as an example of defiant anti-Russian feeling, since it is a movement largely led by intellectuals who tend to be anti-government. So that's a sort of a shift, which is very strange, because otherwise, until recently, Russian was the standard language spoken across all of Belarus. A different perspective on the Belarusian drama scene is offered in an interview with the theatre maker Natalia Kaleda, who together with her husband Nikolai Khaliezin and Vladimir Sherban founded the Belarus Free Theatre in 2005. Political persecution by the Lukashenko regime and the threat of violence forced them to flee the country in 2011, after which they sought political asylum, so that the Belarus Free Theatre has been based in London for the last 10 years. They've received worldwide support and the patronage of figures such as Václav Havel and Tom Stoppard. Despite considerable risks to all those involved, the Belarus Free Theatre has continued to stage performances and events within Belarus, communicating with the company and conducting rehearsals over Skype from London. Kaleda emphasizes that the Belarus Free Theatre has always been a theatre with an international outlook, speaking out about human rights issues and freedom of speech across the globe, as well as drawing attention to human rights abuses in Belarus, Ukraine and Russia. Apparently she actually contrived to hold an event in the House of Commons about freedom of speech in Britain, which was an impressive achievement. When I last tried unsuccessfully to get in touch with her this year, it was at a very bad moment. The authorities in Belarus had published death threats against her and her colleagues, following presumably on the Russian example. The main Belarusian government newspaper, called Sovietska Belarus, which speaks of its own thing. Right, Belarus is a country which still calls its secret police the KGB. The Sovietska Belarus on the 27th of December last year published a piece in which it was stated, "We will definitely find you and we will hang you side by side." Just an example of the work of the Belarus Free Theatre, which I think is one of the more remarkable theatres to go and see in Britain, let alone anywhere else. It's a grueling, intensely physical theatre practice which asks the utmost of their performers. And I'm going to describe for you one production called Burning Doors in 2016, which was staged in London in 2016. And it tells three stories of brutality in police detention and prison. The first story is the story of Maria Alyokhina, who is one of the members of the Pussy Riot group and is one of the people who was put into prison for 2 years. She herself performed herself, and they recreated some of the brutality which was inflicted upon her. And you sit there in the audience watching a woman in a bathtub full of water reciting poetry while a very big man forces her underwater and holds her there until she bursts for air and comes up and carries on writing poetry, and she's forced down again. Another image from that part of the show was more generalized, certainly not literally what happened to her, but you sit in the audience and a woman is surrounded by other members of the cast who tie her hands and feet to a kind of cat's cradle of elasticated ropes. And then when they pull on the ropes, she is forced up into the air and over your head in a sort of starfish shape, in these violent movements, back and forth, back and forth. And so you are confronted with the reality of physical brutality and very much challenged to think how you yourself would respond if asked to undertake any kind of human rights activism which might lead to this kind of threat. A second story was that of Oleg Sentsov, who is a Ukrainian filmmaker who was accused in 2014 after the takeover of Crimea of having conspired against the Russian authorities and of having supposedly plotted to, I think, set fire to a statue of Lenin or something like that anyway. And he was put on trial, much to the outrage of the cultural establishment, cultural people who knew him, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And again, they recreate the interrogation of Sentsov, who is brutalized, hauled up into the air, and the actor on stage wets himself onto the stage as you watch. It's the most, again, very shocking episode. And then the third story which is told is another Russian story about a theatrical activist called Pyotr Pavlensky. I have to say I'm glad that the representation of his activities was less brutal than his own performance actions, since he's notorious for having protested against repression, partly by having on one occasion sewn his lips together, and there are pictures of him with his lips stitched together. He also is known for having stripped off in Red Square before sitting down and nailing his scrotum to the cobblestones. And he also set light to the door of the Lubyanka in Moscow, which is quite a bold thing to do, and that gave us the title Burning Doors. So those are examples of the kind of theatre that the Belarus Free Theatre engages in. One of the things which struck me, partly in the context of this theme of transnationalism, which was important to the book, is the extent to which theatre makers in Moscow, theatre makers in Minsk or from London in Minsk, and theatre makers in Ukraine still actually view the region's ills and distress as a common cause. They may not be working together, they may not be writing in Russian so much anymore, but the Belarus Free Theatre in London writes about the plight of a Ukrainian at the hands of Russians, as well as writing about other Russian issues, and of course there are other plays in which Belarusian problems or issues are addressed. This is equally true from the other end. Gremina wrote a play, what's it called? Two People in Your Home, where an opposition politician, a rival in a obviously hopeless election contest with Lukashenko, was placed under house arrest, and two KGB officers were put to live in the apartment. And Gremina turned this into actually a very humorous piece with the very naggy wife getting the KGB men to do the washing up and sweep the floor and generally do that. But I think I'm still fascinated by this collective feeling that in the post-Soviet sphere, activism against political repression and against censorship in the form of drama is still thriving. Last month, Theatre.doc staged a play about the Belarus protests of 2020, and guess what happened? The police turned up and disrupted it and threw everybody out on the grounds that there was a bomb scare. This was 4 weeks ago, and so all of this is still going on. So this is the project that came together with the help of so many wonderful colleagues and scholars within Oxford and theatre makers from across the world, well, from across the region, and scholars from many other countries. It was an enormous pleasure to edit the book, and for me it was very nice to think that one day I might become a theatre specialist. Thank you very much.